By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
Chapter 1, The Salmon and the Sassenach. The mist clung to the peaks of the Cuillins like a damp woolen blanket that had been left too long in the wash. In the village of Lochdubh, tucked away on the edge of a sea loch that mirrored the leaden sky, the air smelled of peat smoke, salt air, and the faint, persistent scent of frying bacon from the Lochdubh Hotel. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, a tall, lanky man with a shock of fiery red hair and a deceptively vacant expression in his hazel eyes, was currently engaged in what he considered essential police business. To an outsider, it might have looked like poaching. To Hamish, it was simply keeping an eye on the local aquatic life. He stood knee-deep in the chilling waters of the river, his rod twitching with the subtle vibration of a creature that didn't want to be breakfast. With a flick of his wrist that spoke of years of practice and a blatant disregard for the fishing laws of the local estate, he was a man who knew the waters like the back of his hand. Hamish landed a silver-bright Atlantic salmon. "There now, Georgie," Hamish murmured to the air, referring to the local water bailiff who was currently, and conveniently, nursing a hangover in his cottage 3 miles away. "You'd only have ended up in a tourist's freezer. You're better off in my frying pan." Hamish tucked the fish into a burlap sack and whistled for Lugs, his dog of uncertain pedigree and highly certain laziness. Lugs, whose ears were large enough to catch radio signals from the continent, lifted a paw from a patch of damp moss, looked at the sack, and gave a brief, approving wag of his tail. As Hamish made his way back toward the police station, a small, whitewashed building that doubled as his home, he spotted the intrusion. It was a car. Not just any car, but a low-slung, chrome-heavy Italian sports car that looked entirely out of place on a road primarily used by sheep and the occasional rusted Land Rover. It was parked haphazardly across the pavement in front of the post office, its engine ticking with the heat of a high-speed journey from the south. Stepping out of the vehicle was a man who looked as though he had been curated by a London department store. He wore a crisp linen suit in a shade of cream that was a direct insult to the Highland drizzle, and a silk scarf fluttered at his throat. "You there, Constable," the man shouted, his voice carrying the sharp, jagged edges of the home counties. Hamish slowed his pace, his face settling into a mask of polite, slightly dim-witted curiosity. "Good morning to you, sir. It is a fine, damp day we're having." "It's a miserable day," the man snapped, waving a gold-tipped cigarette. "I am Julian Vane. I've bought the old MacReady cottage on the hill. I was told there was what do you call it? A ceilidh tonight. I expect the noise to be kept to a minimum. I've come here for the peace, not to listen to out-of-tune fiddles and drunken caterwauling." Hamish tilted his head, his eyes settling on the man's expensive shoes, which were already being ruined by the Lochdubh mud. "A ceilidh is a grand thing for the soul, Mr. Vane. It's the heartbeat of the village. And the MacReady cottage, well, it's a lovely spot, though the roof has a tendency to migrate in a gale. I've had it renovated," Vane said dismissively. "And I don't care about the heartbeat. I care about my sleep. If I hear one bagpipe after 10 o'clock, I shall expect you to do your duty and shut it down. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal, sir," Hamish said, his voice soft and lilting. "Oh." Though the wind in the chimney can sound remarkably like a pibroch if you've got a vivid imagination. Vane sneered, turned on his heel and climbed back into his car, spraying a fine mist of gravel over Hamish's boots as he accelerated away. Hamish watched the red taillights disappear into the mist. He looked down at the sack containing his illicit salmon and then at Lugs. "I have a feeling, Lugs," Hamish sighed, "that Mr. Vane is going to find that the peace of the Highlands is a very loud thing indeed when you try to get in its way." He walked toward his station, his mind already drifting toward a pot of strong coffee and a thick slice of bread. But the prickle at the back of his neck told him that his quiet day was already over. In Lochdubh, when a Sassenach arrived with that much arrogance and that little sense, someone usually ended up dead, and it was usually Hamish who had to miss his tea to find out why. Chapter 2. The silent accordion, the ceilidh in the Lochdubh village hall was a whirlwind of spinning kilts, heavy boots, and the frantic, joyful skirl of the pipes. It was the sort of event that Julian Vane had so arrogantly dismissed as a communal exhale of the Highland spirit that smelled of damp wool, floor wax, and the water of life. Hamish Macbeth sat in a corner, nursing a single dram of whiskey that he intended to make last until the small hours. He was nominally on duty, which meant he was there to ensure no one threw a chair through a window, and that Archie McLaren didn't try to drive his tractor home after his 5th pint. Beside him, Lugs sat with his head resting on his paws, his soulful eyes tracking the movement of a plate of cocktail sausages on a nearby trestle table. The band, a local trio known as the Heather Hoppers, was led by Pringle Davies, a man whose accordion was as much a part of him as his own limbs. Pringle was a small, bird-like man with a nervous twitch and a talent for squeezing melodies out of his instrument that could make a stone weep or a dead man dance. "He's playing well tonight," a soft voice said. Hamish looked up to see Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was the daughter of the local landowner, a woman of grace and cool beauty who always seemed to exist in a different, more refined climate than the rest of Lochdubh. Her blonde hair was swept back, and her eyes held a spark of amusement as she watched the chaos on the dance floor. "Aye, Pringle has the wind in his sails," Hamish agreed, his voice dropping an octave in her presence. "Though I saw Julian Vane lurking by the door earlier, looking like he had swallowed a wasp. I doubt he appreciates the tempo." "Mr. Vane has been lurking all over the estate, Hamish," Priscilla said, leaning against the wall. "He's been complaining about the boundary fences, the sheep, and even the way the wind whistles through the glen. My father thinks he's a menace. He wants to turn the MacReady cottage into a minimalist retreat. In Lochdubh, it's absurd." "Men like that usually find the Highlands have a way of filling a vacuum," Hamish remarked. Suddenly, the music faltered. It wasn't the usual end of a set. It was a discordant, wheezing groan from the accordion, followed by a thud that was felt more than heard over the chatter of the crowd. The dancers slowed to a halt. The fiddle player, a lanky youth named Ewan, stared down at the stage. Pringle Davies had slumped forward over his instrument. For a moment, it looked as though he had simply fallen asleep from exhaustion. Then his body slid sideways, and the accordion gave one final, haunting gasp of air as it hit the floor. Hamish was moving before the first scream broke the silence. He pushed through the crowd, his deceptive lethargy vanishing into a focused, predatory grace. "Back, now. Give him air," Hamish commanded, his voice ringing with an authority he rarely bothered to use. He knelt beside Pringle. The accordionist's face was a peculiar shade of mottled purple, and his eyes were fixed on the rafters in a stare of terminal surprise. Hamish reached for a pulse, but his fingers met only the cooling stillness of a man who had played his last set. "Is he dead, Hamish?" whispered Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, clutching her pearls. "I'm afraid so," Hamish said softly. He looked at Pringle's hands. They were still clawed as if gripping the keys. Then Hamish's gaze shifted to the accordion. There was something odd about the mouthpiece of the bellows. A small dark smear of something sticky rested near the air intake. "Where is Vane?" Hamish asked, looking around the room. The newcomer was standing near the back exit, his face pale but his expression unreadable. When he saw Hamish looking, he didn't offer help or sympathy. He simply checked his gold watch, tutted at the delay, and walked out into the night. "He died doing what he loved," sobbed a villager. Hamish stood up, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the discarded instrument. Pringle Davies was 70 years old, but he had been as fit as a mountain goat. People in Lochdubh died of old age, or they died of accidents on the loch. They didn't usually drop dead in the middle of a strip the Willow with a face the colour of a bruised plum. "Uggs," Hamish murmured to the dog, who had trotted up to sniff the air around the stage. "I think the piece Mr. Vane wanted has arrived, but I don't think Pringle was the one who was supposed to pay for it." He looked at the open window behind the stage. The curtain fluttered in the damp Highland breeze. Outside, the mist was thick enough to swallow a man whole or a killer. Hamish sighed. He'd have to call Strathbane. He'd have to deal with the brass. And worst of all, he would have to leave his salmon in the fridge for another night. Chapter 3. The arrival of the heavy brigade the rain had transitioned from a fine Scotch mist into a persistent, spiteful vertical assault by the time the heavy black police sedans from Strathbane screeched into the village square. Hamish Macbeth stood at the window of the police station, a chipped mug of coffee cradled in his large, calloused hands. He watched as the doors flew open and a group of men in ill-fitting suits tumbled out, looking as though they had been marinated in cigarette smoke and city cynicism. Leading the charge was Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair was a man who appeared to have been constructed entirely out of high blood pressure and resentment. His face was the colour of a sunset over a polluted industrial estate, and his belly strained against a waistcoat that had long ago given up the struggle for dignity. "Macbeth!" Blair roared before he was even through the door. The sound sent Luggs scurrying under the heavy oak table where he remained, a pair of glowing eyes in the shadows. "Good morning to you, Chief Inspector," Hamish said, his voice a slow melodic drawl that he knew acted like sandpaper on Blair's nerves. "You've made good time. The roads are a bit greasy with the peat." "Don't give me your weather reports, you useless Highland peasant," Blair snapped, shaking his wet coat like a disgruntled terrier. Droplets of Strathbane grime flew everywhere. "I've got a dead body in a community centre, a village full of tight-lipped Tukters, and a 3-hour drive back to a pub that serves decent lager. What have we got? Well, Hamish began, leaning back against the counter with a deceptive air of vacancy. Poor Pringle Davies collapsed during the Ceilidh. He was 70, but he had the heart of a stag. His face was a bit colourful, purple, I say. Heart attack, Blair barked, lighting a cigarette despite the no-smoking sign Hamish had pinned up specifically for him. Old man dancing like a dervish, heart gives out. Case closed. Why the hell did you call us out for a natural death? It's the accordion, sir, Hamish said softly. It made a very strange sound when he went down, and there's a bit of a smell, not like old leather and dust, more like bitter almonds. Blair froze, a cloud of blue smoke hanging around his head. Cyanide? I wouldn't know about such fancy things, sir, Hamish lied smoothly, his eyes wide and innocent. I just thought it was odd that a man's instrument would smell like a Bakewell tart. Blair's eyes narrowed. He hated it when Macbeth was right, and he hated it even more when Macbeth was right, while looking like he was struggling to remember his own middle name. Anderson, MacLean, get down to that hall. Secure the instrument. If there's poison involved, I want to know who was near that stage. The 2 junior detectives, who looked like slightly more hydrated versions of their boss, scurried off. Blair turned back to Hamish, poking a meaty finger into his chest. I know what you're thinking, Macbeth. Or you're thinking you'll solve this, get a pat on the head, and maybe a nice write-up in the Stornoway Gazette. Well, forget it. This is a Strathbane case now. You stay out of the way. Go poach a deer or whatever it is you do when you're not failing to polish your buttons. I was actually thinking of having a bit of porridge, sir, Hamish replied mildly. Right, you do that. Stay here and answer the phones. Don't touch anything. I'm going to go talk to that London fellow Vane. He called the station 3 times this morning complaining about the unhygienic state of the village hall. If anyone has a motive for killing a noisemaker, it's a miserable Sassenach with a grudge against bagpipes. Blair stomped out, his boots clattering on the linoleum. Hamish watched him go, then slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small lint-covered piece of paper. It was a fragment of a label he defound near the stage, partially charred, with only the letter's eyesight visible. He knew Blair would spend the next 6 hours bullying Julian Vane, who would respond with legal threats and arrogance, leading to a glorious stalemate of mutual hatred. Meanwhile, the real answer lay in the gossip of the village, not in Blair's interrogation room. Lugs, Hamish called out. The dog's head popped out from under the table. I think it's time we went for a mooch. I hear Mrs. Gillespie has made a fresh batch of scones, and she always did find Pringle's wife a bit too fond of the local chemist. Hamish pulled on his heavy greatcoat and settled his peaked cap on his head. He looked like the picture of a simple village bobby, but as he stepped out into the rain, his mind was clicking through the social hierarchy of Lochdubh like a well-oiled lock. Pringle Davies had been a popular man, but popularity in a small village was often just a thin veneer over a very deep well of envy. And cyanide, Hamish knew, was a very personal way to say goodbye. Chapter 4. Tea and treachery. While DCI's Blair was busy turning the Lochdubh Hotel's lounge into a makeshift interrogation room, and likely staining the upholstery with nicotine and bad manners, Hamish Macbeth was engaged in a far more delicate operation. He was standing in Mrs. Gillespie's kitchen, watching a pat of butter melt into the steaming heart of a freshly baked scone. Mrs. Gillespie was the village's unofficial intelligence officer. Her windows overlooked the main thoroughfare, and her ears were tuned to a frequency that could pick up a hushed conversation through 3 feet of Highland granite. It's a terrible business, Hamish, she said, her voice a practiced tremolo of grief that didn't quite reach her sharp, calculating eyes. Poor Pringle. To go out like that, right in the middle of the dashing white sergeant. And with that Sassenach, Mr. Vane, looking on like he was watching a play he didn't pay enough for. It's a shock to the system, Hamish agreed, taking a large, appreciative bite. He closed his eyes for a moment, appearing to be lost in the bliss of strawberry jam, but his mind was cataloguing the tension in Mrs. Gillespie's shoulders. Pringle was a well-liked man. I can't think of a soul who would want to see his pipes silenced so permanently. Mrs. Gillespie snorted, a sound like a startled seal. Well-liked? He was a useful man, Hamish. There's a difference. He knew every loose floorboard and leaky pipe in this parish. He spent more time in other people's houses than he did in his own. Hamish tilted his head. Is that so? A bit of a handyman, was he? Handy with his eyes and ears, more like, she whispered, leaning over the table. He saw things, Hamish. He saw who was visiting the widow MacReady at 3 a.m. He saw whose bank statements were looking a bit thin. He called the dancers at the Ceilidh, but he liked to call the tune in private too. Hamish swallowed the last of his scone. The bitter almond scent he had noticed on the accordion mouthpiece began to make a more sinister sort of sense. Cyanide was not just a poison, it was a statement. It was clean, fast, and required access to someone's personal belongings. He had a bit of a problem with wasps, didn't he? Hamish asked conversationally. I recall him mentioning a nest in his attic. Mrs. Gillespie's face darkened. He did. Obsessed with them. He bought all sorts of powders and sprays, but he didn't buy them here. He had them sent from a specialist shop in Inverness. Said the local stuff was watered down by the council. Hamish nodded. He thought of the charred labelicide. Pesticide. Many older, more potent wasp killers contained traces of cyanide compounds, though they were strictly regulated. And his wife, Jessie? Hamish prompted. How is she faring? Jessie Davies is a saint, Mrs. Gillespie said firmly, which is a polite way of saying she's been a doormat for 40 years. Pringle treated her like a piece of furniture that occasionally produced haggis. She's at the manse now, being comforted by Mrs. Wellington. Though if you ask me, she looks more like a woman who's just had a heavy weight lifted off her chest. Hamish bid Mrs. Gillespie a polite farewell, ensuring lugs received a discarded crust, and stepped back out into the drizzle. He didn't head back to the station. Instead, he made his way to the post office. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was busy sorting a pile of damp envelopes. She looked up as the bell chimed, her spectacles perched on the tip of her nose. If you're looking for Blair, he's currently trying to arrest the delivery van driver for speeding, she said dryly. I'm avoiding the great man for now, Mrs. Kennedy, Hamish said with a wink. I was wondering, did Pringle Davies receive any parcels lately? Something that might have smelled a bit chemical. Mrs. Kennedy's expression shifted. She looked around to ensure the shop was empty. He did, a week ago, but it wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to Mr. Vane, up at the cottage. Pringle picked it up for him, said he was going up there to fix a shutter, and would save the gentleman the trip down the hill. Hamish leaned against the counter, his brow furrowed. Pringle delivered a parcel to Julian Vane, the man who hates the village and everyone in it. That's what he said. But I noticed something odd, Hamish. The parcel was leaking a tiny bit of white powder. Pringle didn't seem to mind. He had a look on his face. Well, he looked like a cat that had found the key to the dairy. Hamish thanked her and walked out into the cold air. The pieces were beginning to swirl like the mist over the loch. A nosy handyman, an arrogant outsider, a saintly wife, and a parcel of poison that had changed hands in secret. He looked toward the hill where Vane's cottage sat, looking down on Lochdubh like a fortress of modern disdain. Blair was likely in there right now, shouting and getting nowhere. Hamish knew he needed a different perspective, one that understood the nuances of the upper-class ego and the desperation of those who lived on the fringes of it. He needed Priscilla. Chapter 5. A hint of blue blood the climb to Tommel Castle always made Hamish Macbeth feel like he was stepping back several centuries. While the village of Lochdubh clung to the coast with a sturdy, salt-scrubbed practicality, the castle sat perched on its wooded heights like a reminder of a feudal past that refused to quite fade away. Hamish walked up the long, winding drive, his hands deep in his pockets and lugs trotting at a respectful distance behind. The rain had eased into a silver mist that hung in the ancient pines, making every drip of water sound like a footfall. He found Priscilla Halberton-Smythe in the stables, grooming a sleek chestnut mare. She looked effortlessly elegant in tailored jodhpurs and a barber jacket that actually looked like it had seen a day's work, stark contrast to Julian Vane's pristine, city-bought country attire. I heard the news, Hamish, Priscilla said without looking up, the rhythmic thud brush of her hand against the horse providing a steady beat. The village is in an uproar. My father is already complaining that the police presence is scaring the grouse. The police presence is mostly DCI Blair shouting at the scenery, Hamish replied, leaning against the stable door. He's currently convinced that Julian Vane is a master assassin because he has an English accent and a fast car. Priscilla paused, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She turned to face him, her blue eyes clear and observant. And what do you think, Hamish? Or are you too busy being a useless Highland peasant for Blair's benefit? I'm always busy at that, Priscilla. It takes a great deal of effort to look this idle, Hamish said with a dry chuckle, but I'm bothered by Pringle Davies. Nosy man, but he wasn't a fool. He picked up a parcel for Vane that was leaking powder. Then he drops dead with a mouthful of wasp killer at a ceilidh. Priscilla sighed, setting the brush aside and stepping out into the cobbled yard. Julian Vane is a very specific type of man, Hamish. He's what my father calls new money with old grievances. He didn't just come here for the peace, he came here to rule a small kingdom. He's obsessed with order. I've seen him in the village, looking at the weeds in people's gardens as if they were a personal insult. Order is one thing, Hamish mused, but cyanide is quite another. It's a bit extreme for a man who just wants his hedges trimmed. It's not just hedges, Priscilla said, her voice dropping. Did you know Vane tried to buy the fishing rights to the entire stretch of the river? My father turned him down, of course. Vane was livid. He said the locals were ruinous to the ecosystem with their unsanctioned harvesting. Hamish felt a small prickle of guilt regarding the salmon currently sitting in his fridge, but he kept his expression blank. So he hates poachers. Most gentlemen do. It's more than that. He's a collector, Hamish. Before he moved here, he was quite well known in London for his collection of Victorian taxidermy and rare botanical specimens. He knows his way around preservatives and chemicals. But more importantly, he can't stand being mocked. And Pringle had a wicked tongue when he had a dram. Hamish nodded slowly. Mrs. Gillespie said Pringle knew secrets. If Pringle found out something about Vane, something that would make the big London man look small in front of the village Vane, would hate that more than the noise of the pipes. Exactly, Priscilla agreed. Oh. She reached out and straightened the collar of Hamish's greatcoat, a brief gesture that sent a jolt of warmth through him despite the Highland chill. But remember the social hierarchy, Hamish. A man like Vane doesn't do his own dirty work if he can help it. He considers himself above the mess of life. If he wanted Pringle gone, he'd find a way to make it look like Pringle did it to himself. The saintly wife, Jessie, Hamish thought aloud. She's been a doormat for 40 years. Maybe Vane found a way to hand her the rug. Perhaps, Priscilla said, her eyes searching his. But don't underestimate the villagers, Hamish. They might look like they're under Vane's thumb, but they've been here a lot longer than he has. There's a subtle cruelty in the Highlands that even a Londoner might not understand. Hamish tipped his cap to her, his mind whirring. You've given me a lot to chew on, Priscilla. More than Blair's interrogation notes, certainly. Just don't get yourself into trouble, Hamish, she called out as he turned to leave. I would hate to have to explain to the chief constable why his best man was found face down in a peat bog because he was too busy mooching to watch his back. Hamish didn't look back, but he waved a hand in acknowledgement. As he descended the hill toward the village, the mist seemed to thicken. Priscilla had confirmed one thing. Julian Vane had the means and the temperament for murder. But in Lochdubh, the truth was rarely as shiny and clear as a Sassenach sports car. It was usually buried deep in the peat, waiting for someone with enough patience to dig it up. And Hamish Macbeth was a very patient man. Chapter 6. The Red Herring's Tale, the Lochdubh Hotel's residence lounge, had been transformed into a theatre of the absurd, with DCI Blair playing the role of the Grand Inquisitor and Julian Vane cast as the indignant martyr. The air was thick with the smell of Blair's cheap tobacco and the expensive clinical scent of Vane's cologne. It's open and shut, you pompous little peacock, Blair bellowed, slamming a heavy hand onto a delicate mahogany side table. We found the tin, hidden right at the back of your garden shed, under a pile of imported peat moss. Fast kill wasp destroyer. Active ingredient? Sodium cyanide. The same stuff we found smeared inside the air intake of Pringle Davis accordion. Hamish Macbeth leaned against the doorframe, looking for all the world like a man who was struggling to stay awake during a particularly dull sermon. Lugg sat at his heels, his head tilting back and forth as if following a tennis match. Julian Vane, despite the handcuffs currently glinting on his slender wrists, managed to look down his nose at the detective chief inspector. I have already told you, Inspector Chief Inspector, Blair corrected, his face darkening to a shade of overripe plum. Chief Inspector, Vane continued, his voice dripping with icy disdain. I am a collector of rare botanical specimens. I require pesticides for my conservatory. I did not hide the tin, I stored it. As for the accordion, I wouldn't know which end of the wretched thing to blow into, nor would I wish to touch an object that has been in close proximity to Mr. Davis' hygiene-challenged person. Lies! Blair shouted, turning to his sergeant. Anderson, get him in the car. We're taking him to Strathbane. I'll have a confession out of him before we hit the A82. Excuse me, sir, Hamish interjected softly. His voice was like a pebble dropped into a very loud pond. Blair spun around. What is it, Macbeth? Can you see I'm busy making an arrest that will actually look good on a report? It's just about the tin, sir, Hamish said, scratching the back of his neck and looking confused. The one in the shed. Mrs. Kennedy at the post office said the parcel Pringle delivered to Mr. Vane was leaking white powder. A fine, dusty sort of powder. So, Blair snapped, the seal was broken. More evidence of Vane's negligence. Well, that's the thing, sir, Hamish said, his eyes wandering to the ceiling. I took a look at that tin while you were inside the cottage. It's a modern plastic canister with a screw-top lid and a foil seal. Even if the seal were broken, It wouldn't leak powder through a cardboard mailing box unless the whole thing was crushed. And Mr. Vane's car is very clean, sir. Not a speck of white dust in the boot. Blair's eyes narrowed. What are you getting at, you gingerhead nuisance? And then there's Pringle's hands, Hamish continued. Unperturbed, Pringle was a fiddly man. He cleaned his accordion every night with a special chamois cloth. If he had seen white powder on his instrument, he would have wiped it off before he ever put it to his lips or started pumping the bellows. Unless he didn't see it because it wasn't powder when it was put there. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, clear evidence bag. Inside was a tiny, dried-up fragment of what looked like a common garden slug. I found this near the stage, Hamish said. It's a bit of gel. High-strength contact adhesive mixed with the pesticide. It stays clear and sticky for hours. Someone didn't sprinkle powder, they painted a trap. Vane could have painted it, Blair countered, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. But Mr. Vane was at the bar when Pringle was setting up, Hamish said, his gaze shifting to Vane. I saw him myself. He was complaining about the brand of gin. He never went near the stage. But do you know who did? Someone who was helping Pringle move his heavy equipment. Someone who knew exactly where Pringle put his hands and where the air sucked into the bellows. Vane sneered at Blair. There. You see, even your local village idiot has more cognitive function than you, Chief Inspector. Blair's roar of fury could be heard all the way to the pier. He didn't release Vane, but he did order Anderson to stay put. He turned on Hamish, his finger vibrating with rage. If this isn't Vane, Macbeth, you better find me a body to put in these cuffs by sunset, or I'll have you directing traffic in the middle of a Glasgow winter. Hamish watched them lead Vane away to a side room for further questioning, which mostly involved Blair shouting until he was hoarse. Lugs, Hamish whispered. Mr. Vane is a nasty piece of work, but he's a man who pays people to do his killing for him, and there's no money in Pringle's death. This wasn't about a conservatory. It was about something much smaller. He thought back to the leaking parcel. If the tin wasn't leaking, then someone had made it look like it was. Someone had wanted the trail to lead directly to the Sassenach. Hamish walked out of the hotel and looked toward the manse. He needed to speak to the saintly widow again. Not about the murder, but about Pringle's handyman work. Because in Lochdubh, the only thing more dangerous than a man with a secret was a man who knew everyone else. Chapter 7. The handyman's ledger, the manse, was a tall, drafty building that always seemed to be fighting a losing battle against the encroaching ivy and the damp Highland air. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of furniture polish and the forced solemnity of Mrs. Wellington's drawing room. Hamish Macbeth sat on the edge of a velvet chair that felt as though it had been stuffed with gravel. Opposite him, Jessie Davies sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap like two pale, exhausted birds. She looked smaller in her widow's weeds, her face a mask of quiet resignation that Hamish found more unsettling than a flood of tears. "It's very kind of you to check on me, Hamish," Jessie said, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "But the Chief Inspector has already been here. He was very loud. He seemed quite certain that Mr. Vane is the devil incarnate. DC Blair has a way of seeing the world in black and white, Jessie," Hamish said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Mainly because it saves him the trouble of thinking in colour. But I was wondering about Pringle's work. He was a busy man, always out and about. He was," she sighed. "He never could sit still, always fixing a hinge or clearing a gutter. He said the village would fall apart without him, and he kept records, did he not? For the taxes." A small, bitter smile flickered across Jessie's lips. Pringle and taxes were strangers, Hamish, but he kept a job book. He said it was to remember which parts he had ordered, but he spent more time writing in it than he did with a wrench. I don't suppose I could have a look at it, just to see if he had any outstanding appointments that might shed some light. "It's in the kitchen by the stove. I was going to burn it," Jessie said, her eyes fixed on a fraying patch of carpet. "There's nothing in there but grease and spite." Hamish excused himself, leaving Mrs. Wellington to descend upon the widow with another tray of medicinal tea. In the kitchen, he found the book. It was a battered leather-bound diary, its pages stained with tea and something that looked suspiciously like engine oil. As Hamish flipped through the pages, his lazy expression vanished. Pringle Davies hadn't just been recording plumbing repairs. He had been mapping the sins of Lochdubh. May 14th, Mrs. Gillespie. Kitchen sink. Found the receipt for the Inverness jeweller, not the one her husband bought her. £400 for silence. June 2nd, the minister. Study window. Saw the bottle of gin behind the Bible. God provides, but Pringle collects. August 10th, Julian Vane. Conservatory. Found the letter from the London firm. Vane isn't a gentleman collector. He's a failed broker with a forged pedigree. He's hiding from his creditors in the mist. Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the draft from the back door. Pringle Davies was not just a nosy neighbour, he was a systematic blackmailer who had turned the village into a private gold mine. Every squeaky floorboard he fixed had given him a chance to peer into a drawer or overhear a phone call. But then he reached the last entry, dated only 2 days ago. October 12th. The saint herself. Finally found where she keeps the tonic. She thinks I don't know why she stays so quiet. 1 more year, and we'll have enough to move to Spain. Shall hate the sun, but I'll like the brandy. Hamish closed the book. The saintly Jessie had not been a doormat, she had been an accomplice, or perhaps a victim of a different kind. Find what you were looking for, Macbeth. Hamish jumped. DCI Blair was standing in the doorway, his face a triumphant shade of magenta. He held a pair of latex gloves in one hand and a small glass vial in the other. "Look at this," Blair gloated, waving the vial. Found it in the back of the medicine cabinet. Chloral hydrate. A sedative, strong enough to knock out a horse or make a man dizzy enough to accidentally smear poison on his own instrument. "Where did you find it, sir?" Hamish asked, his mind racing. "Right here in the manse kitchen." The widow must have been slipping it into his tea. She probably wanted his insurance money. It's a classic. Wife kills husband to escape a lifetime of boredom. But what about the cyanide, sir? The leaking parcel addressed to Vane? A distraction, Blair shouted. She probably stole it from Vane's shed. Women are cunning like that. I am arresting her now. It'll be the biggest case in the Highlands this year. I might even get that moved to Edinburgh. Hamish looked back at the job book hidden under his coat. He thought of Jessie's pale, exhausted face. Blair was halfway to a truth, but as usual, he was ignoring the most important part of the story. Pringle hadn't just been killed because someone hated him. He had been killed because he was about to take someone's last piece of dignity. And in the Highlands, dignity was often the only thing people had left. "Lugs," Hamish whispered as he followed Blair back into the drawing room. "I think the Chief Inspector is about to make a very big mistake, and I think I know why the saint is so quiet." He looked at the widow as Blair began to read her rights. She didn't look surprised. She looked relieved, but Hamish's eyes weren't on Jessie, they were on the half-open door to the minister's study, where the scent of bitter almonds was suddenly, terrifyingly present. Chapter 8. The minister's secret. The hallway of the manse was a chaotic stage. DC Furs Blair was practically preening, his chest puffed out so far that a button on his waistcoat threatened to become a projectile. Jessie Davies was being led toward the door by Sergeant Anderson, her face a mask of such profound exhaustion that she looked as though she might simply dissolve into the floorboards. "A clean sweep, Macbeth," Blair crowed, ignoring the way the wind rattled the heavy front door. "Motive, means, and opportunity. The wife always has the most to gain." She wanted out of this damp little hellhole, and she didn't want to go to Spain with a man she clearly loathed. "Now, get out of my way. I have a press release to dictate in my head." Hamish stood aside, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat that would have fooled anyone who didn't know him. "Aye, sir. A grand piece of detective work, truly." As the heavy door thudded shut behind them, leaving the manse in a sudden ringing silence, Hamish didn't follow. He turned instead toward the end of the hallway, where the door to the minister's study stood slightly ajar. The scent of bitter almonds was no longer a ghost. It was a physical presence, sharp and medicinal, cutting through the usual smell of old paper and stale incense. Hamish pushed the door open. The Reverend Mr. Wellington was sitting behind his mahogany desk. He was a man who usually projected an aura of stern, unyielding holiness, but now he looked like a suit of clothes with the man removed. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands resting on a leather-bound Bible were shaking. "She's gone, then?" Wellington asked, his voice a dry rasp. "The Chief Inspector has taken Jessie?" "He has, Minister," Hamish said softly, moving into the room with the quiet tread of a woodsman. "He's convinced she's the one. He found the chloral hydrate in the kitchen." Wellington closed his eyes. "Lord forgive us all. The things we do for love, and the things we do for pride." Hamish wandered toward the corner of the room. Beside a collection of theological texts sat a small portable darkroom kit. In the Victorian era, photography had been a hobby for the learned, and it seemed the minister was a traditionalist. There were trays, bottles of developer, and a small brown glass jar labelled potassium ferrocyanide. "It's a fine hobby, photography," Hamish mused, tapping the jar with a fingernail. "It requires a steady hand and a great deal of patience. And the chemicals, they can be quite dangerous if they are not handled with care." The minister didn't look up. "Pringle came in here to fix the sash cord on the window. He was always fixing things, Hamish, but he was really looking. He found the letters." The letters from the bank? Hamish asked, remembering the entry in the ledger about the minister's tonic. My wife, Mrs. Wellington, she has a delicate constitution, the minister whispered. The tonic wasn't alcohol, Hamish. It was a gambling debt, a staggering, impossible debt accrued through those wicked machines in the city during her visits to her sister. Pringle found the notices. He told me that if I didn't pay him monthly, he would ensure the presbytery found out. He would make sure the saint of Lochdubh was cast out in a storm of scandal. Hamish pulled a chair up and sat down, looking not like a policeman but like a neighbour settling in for a long chat. And so you paid him. But the well was running dry, wasn't it? I couldn't lose her, Hamish, and I couldn't lose the church, Wellington said, a single tear tracking through the deep lines of his face. When I saw the way he treated Jessieth, way he mocked her, even as he used her to hide his gains, something in me broke. I knew he was going to Julian Vane next. He told me he was going to bridge the gap between the old money and the new. He was going to bleed this village white. So you decided to stop the bleeding, Hamish said. I didn't think it would work, the minister sobbed. I thought I would just make him ill. Just enough to stop him from playing. Just enough to give us time. I put the gel on the mouthpiece while he was in the cloakroom. I knew he always tested the bellows before the first set, but the concentration... I didn't realize how potent the old chemicals were. Hamish sighed. It was the hidden motive he had suspected, not greed, not a grand conspiracy, but the desperate, petty terror of a man trying to hold a crumbling reputation together with both hands. And the parcel for Vane? Hamish asked. I took it from the post office when Mrs. Kennedy was in the back. I sprinkled a little of the powder inside and made it leak. I wanted the suspicion to fall on the outsider. He's a cruel man, Hamish. I thought the village would be better off if he were gone too. Hamish looked out the window at the rain-streaked Highland hills. He could feel the weight of the arrest in the air. Blair would be halfway to Strathbane by now, bragging about his brilliance, while the real killer sat in a chair 3 feet away, broken by his own conscience. You have a choice, Minister, Hamish said, his voice barely a whisper. Blair is a man who loves a confession. He'll make it a spectacle. I need to make a phone call. I need to ensure that Jessie Davies isn't the one who pays for your protection of the village. The minister looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Will you arrest me, Hamish? I'm just a lazy policeman, Minister, Hamish said, standing up and settling his cap. I don't like arrests. They involve a great deal of paperwork. But I do like the truth. And I think it's time the truth had a bit of air. As Hamish walked out of the manse, Lugs was waiting for him under the porch. The dog looked up, his tail giving a single mournful thump. We've got him, Lugs, Hamish murmured. But now comes the hard part. I have to find a way to catch the fox without letting the hounds know I was the one who opened the gate. Chapter 9, the trap is set. The Lochdubh police station felt unusually cavernous with only Lugs for company. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the steady drum of rain against the window pane were the only sounds, save for the occasional sigh from the dog. Hamish Macbeth sat at his desk, staring at the black rotary telephone as if it were a venomous snake. To solve a crime was easy enough if one had the eyes to see and the patience to listen. The difficulty for Hamish lay in the aftermath. If he marched into Strathbane and presented the Reverend Mr. Wellington as the killer, the chief constable would be so impressed that Hamish would find himself promoted to sergeant and stationed in a bleak, grey suburb of Glasgow before the week was out. He would be surrounded by concrete smog and people who didn't know the difference between a rising trout and a submerged boot. I cannot have that, Lugs, Hamish said, reaching for the phone. I simply cannot. He dialed the number for the Strathbane headquarters. When DCI Blair finally came to the line, he sounded as though he were chewing on a particularly tough piece of gristle. What is it now, Macbeth? I'm in the middle of processing the Davies woman. She's gone quiet, which means she's ready to crack. It's about the search, sir, Hamish said, his voice reaching a pitch of nervous uncertainty. I was just tidying up the manse after you left out of respect for the church. You understand, and I found something odd in the vestry. The vestry. I searched the manse, you idiot. Aye, sir, but the vestry is attached to the kirk itself. There's a cupboard there, full of old communion wine and, well, it smells very strongly of those Bakewell tarts again. I didn't want to touch it, seeing as I'm just a local bobby and don't have your refined nose for evidence. There was a long silence on the other end. Hamish could practically hear the gears of greed grinding in Blair's head. If there was more poison in the church, it turned a simple domestic murder into a satanic Highland plot, the kind of headline that made careers. Don't touch a thing, Blair barked. I'm coming back. And listen, Macbeth, keep your mouth shut. If the press gets wind of this before I've secured the scene, I'll have your badge. Of course, sir. I'll just sit here and wait for the experts." Hamish hung up, a small, weary smile touching his lips. Part 1 of the plan was in motion, now for the village telegraph. He walked over to the post office, where Mrs. Kennedy was currently holding court for a group of 3 elderly women who were dissecting Jesse Davison's character with surgical precision. "Terrible news," Hamish announced as he stepped inside, looking appropriately frazzled. "What is it, Hamish?" Mrs. Kennedy asked, her spectacles gleaming. "The Strathbane boys are coming back with a chemical illuminator," Hamish lied, widening his eyes. "A new invention from London. They say it can find a single drop of poison on a man's clothes or a woman's hands, even if they've scrubbed them with bleach. It turns the skin bright blue under a special lamp. DCI Blair says no one is to leave their houses until the blue light has passed over every soul in the parish." A collective gasp went up. By the time Hamish had walked back to the station, the rumour would have reached the manse, the hotel, and every cottage in between. In a village where everyone had something to hide, it was a poached salmon, a hidden bottle, or a darker secret. The thought of a magic light was terrifying. Hamish knew exactly what the minister would do. A man of God, already crushed by guilt, would not wait for the blue light to reveal his shame. He would attempt to rid himself of the remaining evidence, the photography chemicals, and the ledger of Pringle's blackmail before the experts arrived. But Hamish had timed it perfectly. Blair, driven by the prospect of a sensational find in the Kirk, would be arriving at high speed, his sirens likely screaming. Hamish took his position behind a thicket of gorse near the manse's back garden. The air was cold, and the damp seeped through his trousers, but he waited with the stillness of a heron. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, the back door of the manse creaked open. The Reverend Mr. Wellington emerged, clutching a heavy burlap sack. He moved with a frantic, jerky gait toward the old stone well at the edge of the property. At that exact moment, the blue flashing lights of Blair's sedan appeared at the bottom of the hill, the siren wailing like a banshee through the mist. The minister froze, his face illuminated by the distant strobe of the police car. To a guilty conscience, the siren wasn't just a car, it was the voice of judgment. Wellington panicked. Instead of dropping the bag into the well, he stumbled, the bag splitting open. Bottles of chemical developer and the dark glass jar of ferrocyanide shattered against the stone, splashing his trousers and shoes with a distinctive, pungent liquid. "Lord, have mercy!" the minister cried out, collapsing to his knees just as Blair's car screeched into the driveway, gravel flying. Hamish stepped out from the shadows, looking surprised and utterly stupid. "Oh, dear," Hamish said, trotting toward the scene. "It looks like the minister has had an accident with his hobby, Chief Inspector. And just look at the smell, it's exactly like the accordion." Blair leaped from the car, his eyes bugging out at the sight of the shattered bottles and the broken man. He didn't see the trap, he only saw the glory. "Macbeth, you bumbling fool!" Blair shouted, though he was grinning like a shark. He was trying to dump the evidence, get the cuffs. "I've caught the Highland Strangler in the act." Hamish stood back, patting Lugs on the head. Oh, he had cleared Jesse, caught the killer, and made sure Blair took every bit of the credit. He was safe. For now, he was still just the useless PC Macbeth of Lochdubh. 9. The trap is set. The Lochdubh police station felt unusually cavernous with only Lugs for company. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the steady drum of rain against the window pane were the only sounds, save for the occasional sigh from the dog. Hamish Macbeth sat at his desk, staring at the black rotary telephone as if it were a venomous snake. To solve a crime was easy enough if one had the eyes to see and the patience to listen. The difficulty for Hamish lay in the aftermath. If he marched into Strathbane and presented the Reverend Mr. Wellington as the killer, the chief constable would be so impressed that Hamish would find himself promoted to sergeant and stationed in a bleak, grey suburb of Glasgow before the week was out. He would be surrounded by concrete, smog, and people who didn't know the difference between a rising trout and a submerged boot. "I cannot have that, Lugs," Hamish said, reaching for the phone. "I simply cannot." He dialed the number for the Strathbane headquarters. When DC Blair finally came to the line, he sounded as though he were chewing on a particularly tough piece of gristle. "What is it now, Macbeth?" "I'm in the middle of processing the Davies woman. She's gone quiet, which means she's ready to crack." "It's about the search, sir," Hamish said, his voice reaching a pitch of nervous uncertainty. "I was just tidying up the manse after you left out of respect for the church. You understand, and I found something odd. In the vestry." "The vestry?" "Search the manse, you idiot." "Aye, sir, but the vestry is attached to the kirk itself. There's a cupboard there full of old communion wine and, well, it smells very strongly of those Bakewell tarts again. I didn't want to touch it. seeing as I'm just a local bobby and don't have your refined nose for evidence." There was a long silence on the other end. Hamish could practically hear the gears of greed grinding in Blair's head. If there was more poison in the church, it turned a simple domestic murder into a satanic Highland plot, the kind of headline that made careers. "Don't touch a thing," Blair barked. "I'm coming back. And listen, Macbeth, keep your mouth shut. If the press gets wind of this before I've secured the scene, I'll have your badge." "Of course, sir. I'll just sit here and wait for the experts." Hamish hung up, a small, weary smile touching his lips. Part one of the plan was in motion. Now for the village telegraph. He walked over to the post office, where Mrs. Kennedy was currently holding court for a group of 3 elderly women who were dissecting Jesse Davison's character with surgical precision. "Terrible news," Hamish announced as he stepped inside, looking appropriately frazzled. "What is it, Hamish?" Mrs. Kennedy asked, her spectacles gleaming. "The Strathbane boys are coming back with a chemical illuminator," Hamish lied, widening his eyes. "A new invention from London. They say it can find a single drop of poison on a man's clothes or a woman's hands, even if they've scrubbed them with bleach. It turns the skin bright blue under a special lamp. DC Vars says no one is to leave their houses until the blue light has passed over every soul in the parish." A collective gasp went up. By the time Hamish had walked back to the station, the rumour would have reached the manse, the hotel, and every cottage in between. In a village where everyone had something to hide, it was a poached salmon, a hidden bottle, or a darker secret. The thought of a magic light was terrifying. Hamish knew exactly what the minister would do. A man of God, already crushed by guilt, would not wait for the blue light to reveal his shame. He would attempt to rid himself of the remaining evidence, the photography chemicals, and the ledger of Pringle's blackmail before the experts arrived. But Hamish had timed it perfectly. Blair, driven by the prospect of a sensational find in the kirk, would be arriving at high speed, his sirens likely screaming. Hamish took his position behind a thicket of gorse near the manse's back garden. The air was cold, and the damp seeped through his trousers, but he waited with the stillness of a heron. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, the back door of the manse creaked open. The Reverend Mr. Wellington emerged, clutching a heavy burlap sack. He moved with a frantic, jerky gait toward the old stone well at the edge of the property. At that exact moment, the blue flashing lights of Blair's sedan appeared at the bottom of the hill, the siren wailing like a banshee through the mist. The minister froze, his face illuminated by the distant strobe of the police car. To a guilty conscience, the siren wasn't just a car, it was the voice of judgment. Wellington panicked. Instead of dropping the bag into the well, he stumbled, the bag splitting open. Bottles of chemical developer and the dark glass jar of ferrocyanide shattered against the stone, splashing his trousers and shoes with a distinctive, pungent liquid. "Lord, have mercy," the minister cried out, collapsing to his knees just as Blair's car screeched into the driveway, gravel flying. Hamish stepped out from the shadows, looking surprised and utterly stupid. "Oh dear," Hamish said, trotting toward the scene. "It looks like the minister has had an accident with his hobby, Chief Inspector, and just look at the smell, it's exactly like the accordion." Blair leaped from the car, his eyes bugging out at the sight of the shattered bottles and the broken man. He didn't see the trap, he only saw the glory. "Macbeth, you bumbling fool," Blair shouted, though he was grinning like a shark. He was trying to dump the evidence. "Get the cuffs. I've caught the Highland Strangler in the act." Hamish stood back, patting Lugs on the head. He had cleared Jesse, caught the killer, and made sure Blair took every bit of the credit. He was safe. For now, he was still just the useless PC Macbeth of Lochdubh. Chapter 10. The confrontation, the air in the manse garden was thick with the scent of ozone from the storm and the cloying, almond-bitter stench of the shattered chemicals. Under the strobing blue light of the police cruiser, the Reverend Mr. Wellington looked less like a minister and more like a cornered animal, his clerical collar askew and his face smeared with Highland mud. "Don't move, you murderous old hypocrite!" DCI Blair screamed, his hand hovering over his holster, as if he expected the minister to pull a machine gun from his vestments. "Anderson, get the cuffs on him!" "Move!" But the minister wasn't listening to Blair. He was staring at the shattered glass at his feet, his eyes wide and vacant. The realization that his life, his reputation, and his sanctuary were gone had snapped the last thread of his composure. When Sergeant Anderson stepped forward, heavy-footed and confident, Wellington didn't surrender. He lunged. With a strength born of pure, hysterical desperation, the minister shoved Anderson back into a rosebush and bolted. He didn't head for the road, he ran toward the back of the garden, where the ground sloped steeply down toward the jagged rocks of the loch. "He's getting away. Shoot him. Do something." Blair yelled. Though he himself remained firmly planted on the gravel driveway, his expensive city shoes clearly not designed for a pursuit through wet peat. Hamish Macbeth, who had been standing by with a look of mild concern, suddenly shifted. The lazy slouch vanished. His long legs ate up the distance with a deceptive, predatory speed that few in Lochdubh ever saw. He didn't shout, he didn't draw a weapon. He simply ran, his greatcoat flapping behind him like the wings of a large ginger bird of prey. "Minister!" "Stop now," Hamish called out, his voice steady even as he vaulted over a low stone wall. Wellington didn't stop. He reached the edge of the slope, his boots slipping on the slick grass. He was heading for the Black Crag, a sheer drop into the freezing waters of the loch. It wasn't an escape, it was a final, desperate exit. Hamish reached him just as the minister's foot skidded on the verge. With a sudden burst of Highland sinew, Hamish dived. He tackled the older man around the waist, the two of them hitting the mud and sliding several feet toward the precipice. They came to a halt inches from the edge. Wellington struggled with surprising ferocity, his fingernails clawing at Hamish's sleeves. "Let me go, Macbeth. I cannot face them. I cannot face the shame." "It's not for you to decide when the service is over, Minister," Hamish grunted, pinning the man's arms with a grip that felt like iron bands. He ignored the sting of a scratch across his cheek. Enough death in Lochdubh for 1 week. "Well, I've no more." For a moment they wrestled in the dark, two shadows silhouetted against the grey expanse of the water. Then the fight went out of the minister. He collapsed into a fit of sobbing, his forehead resting against the damp earth. Lugs arrived a moment later, barking with a mixture of excitement and disapproval. He circled the pair, eventually settling for a quick, sympathetic lick to the minister's ear. "Get up, then," Hamish said, his voice returning to its soft, lilting drawl. He hauled Wellington to his feet, keeping a firm hand on his elbow. The minister was trembling, his dignity lying somewhere back in the shattered glass of the darkroom chemicals. By the time they crested the hill and returned to the driveway, Blair and Anderson were waiting. Blair looked furious, mostly because he had missed the actual capture, and his trousers were splattered with mud from his brief, unsuccessful attempt to follow. "Give him here," Blair snapped, snatching the minister's arm from Hamish. "Attempted escape, resisting arrest, and murder. You're going away for a long time, Wellington. I'll see to it personally." "He was just a bit confused, sir," Hamish said, wiping the mud from his face with a handkerchief. "The fumes, you see, they can turn a man's head." "Shut up, Macbeth," Blair growled. "You're lucky I don't charge you with negligence for letting him run in the first place. Anderson, get him in the back of the car, and find that bag of evidence. I want every shard of glass catalogued." As the police car sped away, its siren a fading wail in the distance, Hamish stood alone in the dark garden. "Oh!" He felt a sharp pain in his shoulder where he had hit the ground, and his uniform was a ruin of peat and grass stains. He looked down at lugs. "Well, that's that then. The minister goes to the cells, and Jessie Davies goes home to a quiet house. A bit too quiet, perhaps." He reached into his pocket and felt the small job book he had taken from the manse. He knew he should hand it over to Blair, but he thought of the secrets inside, the petty shames, and the small human failings of his neighbours. If Blair got a hold of it, the village would be torn apart by investigative curiosity. Hamish walked over to the old well. With a flick of his wrist, the book vanished into the black depths. "A policeman's job is to keep the peace. Lugs," Hamish murmured. "Not to burn the village down, just to catch a few sparks." He turned and began the long walk back to the station. He was tired, he was hungry, and he was quite certain that by tomorrow, DC First would have convinced himself and the chief constable that he had tackled the minister himself. And that was exactly how Hamish Macbeth wanted it. Chapter 11. The credit shift the morning sun in Lochdubh was a rare and fragile thing. A pale lemon light that struggled to penetrate the lingering steam rising from the wet heather. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was considerably more heated. DC First Blair was pacing the small room, his footsteps heavy enough to make the floorboards groan in protest, while the smell of stale cigarettes and victory followed him like a cloud. Hamish Macbeth sat at the small table, nursing a mug of coffee and looking as though he had spent the night sleeping in a ditch, which, technically, he had. His uniform was stained with the dark, peaty mud of the manse garden, and a jagged scratch across his cheek was a vivid reminder of the minister's final struggle. "It's a masterpiece, Anderson," Blair was shouting to his silent sergeant. "The press are going to eat this up. Brilliant detective snares sinister minister in midnight pursuit. I can see the headline now. It has everything. Religion, poison, and a high-speed chase on foot." Hamish cleared his throat, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a path. "It was a fine piece of work, sir, especially the way you spotted that chemical bottle from 20 yards in the dark. I would have walked right past it. Blair stopped pacing and looked at Hamish. For a moment a flicker of suspicion crossed his bloodshot eyes. He remembered vaguely that he had been standing on the gravel driveway while Macbeth disappeared into the darkness. But the memory was blurry, filtered through the adrenaline of the arrest and the 4 whiskies he had consumed back at the hotel to settle his nerves. Yes, well, Blair blustered, straightening his tie. It's all about the training, Macbeth. You either have the instinct or you don't. Your Highland boys are fine for opening gates and pointing the way to the pub, but when it comes to the real grit, well, it takes a city man. Aye, sir, Hamish said, his voice a model of humble submission. I was just thinking about the report. The Chief Constable will be wanting a very detailed account of how you cornered the Reverend at the edge of the Black Crag. I've started a draft here, but I'm afraid my prose is a bit rustic. Hamish slid a sheet of paper across the table. Oh. He had spent the early hours of the morning carefully crafting a narrative that painted Blair as a cross between Sherlock Holmes and a commando. In Hamish's version of events, Blair had directed the entire pursuit, while Hamish had merely provided minor physical assistance as a human tether. Blair picked up the paper, his eyes darting across the lines. Under the brilliant tactical direction of DCI Blair, the suspect was outmaneuvered by Blair's superior positioning. The decisive arrest was secured by the Chief Inspector's presence of mind. A slow, greasy smile spread across Blair's face. Not bad, Macbeth. A bit wordy, but it captures the essence of the thing. I suppose I did show a fair bit of tactical brilliance out there. You did indeed, sir, Hamish urged gently. And if you were to submit this tonight, I'm sure the promotion board would be looking at it by Monday. Of course, they might want to talk to me too, but I'm sure you could tell them I'm better suited to staying here in Lochdubh. I am a simple man, sir. I'd only get lost in a big city like Edinburgh or Glasgow. I would be a liability to a man of your calibre. Blair looked at Hamish, seeing only a lanky, mud-stained peasant with no ambition and even less sense. The thought of having to drag Macbeth along to a higher posting or worse, having Macbeth's name mentioned in the same breath as his own in the commendation, was intolerable. You're right for once, Macbeth, Blair said, snatching the report and tucking it into his breast pocket. You're a local fixture, like a standing stone or a particularly stubborn goat. You'd be useless in the big smoke. I'll make sure the Chief Constable knows you were present, in a supportive capacity. That's all I ask, sir, Hamish said, leaning back and taking a slow sip of his coffee. The door to the station swung open, and Julian Vane stepped in. He was no longer in handcuffs, but his suit was wrinkled, and his pride was clearly in tatters. He looked at Blair with a loathing that was almost physical. I have just spoken to my solicitor, Vane snapped. The way I have been treated is an outrage. I was detained, insulted, and my property was searched without a proper warrant. Quiet. You! Blair barked, pointing a finger at him. You are a person of interest in a murder investigation. You're lucky I'm not charging you with obstructing justice for that hidden wasp killer. Now, get out of here before I find something else to arrest you for. I've got a press conference to prepare for. Vane sputtered, looked at Hamish, who gave him a vacant, friendly nod, and then stormed out, his expensive shoes clicking furiously on the pavement. Right, Blair said, checking his watch. We're off. Anderson, get the car. Macbeth, clean yourself up. You look like a chimney sweep. And for God's sake, don't mention the blue light rumour to the press if they come sniffing around. I don't want the department looking like it believes in ghost stories. Not a word, sir, Hamish promised. He watched from the window as the black police sedans roared out of the village, their tyres kicking up a spray of salt-tinged water. The piece of Lochdubh was already beginning to settle back into the soil. The drama was over, the credit had been safely diverted into the bottomless pit of Blair's ego, and the threat of promotion had vanished like the morning mist. Luggs trotted over and leaned against Hamish's leg, looking up with an expectant expression. Aye, Luggs, Hamish sighed, scratching the dog behind his tattered ears. The great man is gone, and we're still here. I think there's half a salmon in the fridge with our names on it, provided we can eat it before Georgie the bailiff wakes up and starts counting his fish. Chapter 12. The quiet return, the silence that followed the departure of the Strathbane police was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical weight that settled over Lochdubh like a well-worn tweed coat. The sirens, the shouting, and the heavy-footed arrogance of the city detectives had evaporated, leaving behind only the cry of a lone gull and the rhythmic, soothing slap of the loch against the pier. Inside the police station kitchen, the air was heavy with a much more pleasant scent. The aroma of fresh butter foaming in a heavy iron skillet and the delicate pink-orange fragrance of frying Atlantic salmon. Hamish Macbeth stood over his small stove, a wooden spatula in one hand and a mug of steaming coffee in the other. He looked remarkably relaxed for a man who had recently wrestled a man of the cloth on the edge of a precipice. Luggs sat by the door, his nose twitching in time with the sizzle of the fish. He knew his place in the hierarchy, and he knew that the crispy tail end of that salmon had his name written all over it. A light knock at the door preceded the arrival of Priscilla Halberton-Smythe. She stepped inside, bringing with her the scent of the crisp morning air and expensive soap. She looked at Hamish, then at the fish, and finally at the small, bruised scratch on his cheek. "I see the hero of the hour is back to his usual criminal activities," she said, a playful glint in her blue eyes. "Does the water bailiff know you're celebrating the minister's arrest with the estate's finest livestock?" "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Priscilla," Hamish said, his face a picture of wounded innocence. "This fish practically jumped into my arms out of pure shock at the recent scandal. It would have been a waste to let it go to a watery grave." Priscilla laughed, a low melodic sound that always made Hamish's heart do a small, involuntary hop. She sat at the small wooden table, leaning her chin on her hand. "The papers are full of it, Hamish. Or rather, they're full of him. DCI Blair is being hailed as the Iron Fist of the Highlands. There's a photograph of him in the Strathbane Sentinel looking incredibly stern next to a bag of evidence. He didn't mention you once." "And thank the good Lord for that," Hamish muttered, sliding a perfectly cooked fillet onto a chipped plate. "If he had mentioned me, the chief constable would be up here tomorrow with a sergeant's stripes and a map of a housing estate in Paisley. I'm happy to let Blair have the glory, as long as I get to keep the peace." "The peace is a bit tarnished, don't you think?" Priscilla asked, her tone softening. "The minister, it's a tragedy, and Jessie Davies. The village doesn't know whether to pity her or shun her for her husband's sins." Hamish sighed, the steam from his coffee clouding his eyes for a moment. Lochdubh has a short memory for tragedy, but a long one for gossip. In a month's time, Pringle Davies will be remembered as a saintly musician, and the minister as a man who had a nervous turn. "We prefer our darkness buried deep in the peat, Priscilla. It's easier to live with that way." "And Julian Vane?" "Gone," Hamish said with a satisfied nod. "Ah, he packed his Italian sports car and fled back to London this morning. He said the Highlands were savage and unhygienic. He's put the MacReady cottage back on the market. I expect we'll get a retired schoolteacher or a quiet weaver next time. Someone who doesn't mind the sound of the pipes." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the clock and Lug's enthusiastic crunching of a salmon's skin. It was the kind of silence Hamish lived for, the quiet return to a routine where the biggest problem was a stray sheep or a blocked drain. "You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth," Priscilla said, standing up to leave. She paused by the door and reached out, her fingers briefly brushing the scratch on his face. "You solve the crimes everyone else misses, and then you work twice as hard to make sure no one knows you did it." "It's the only way to stay a free man in this world, Priscilla," Hamish replied softly. After she had gone, Hamish finished his meal and took a second pot of coffee out to the small bench in front of the station. The mist was lifting, revealing the Cuillins in all their rugged, indifferent glory. The air was cold, but the sun felt warm on his skin. The phone inside the station began to ring. It was likely a call from headquarters about a missing set of bolt cutters. Or perhaps Mrs. Gillespie complaining that Archie McLean's cow was looking at her garden with unholy intent. Hamish didn't move. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the phone ring. He had caught a killer, saved a widow, and successfully deceived the most self-important man in the Scottish police force. He figured he had earned at least another 20 minutes of laziness before the world started demanding his attention again. "It's a grand life, Luggs," he whispered to the sleeping dog, "provided you don't let anyone know you're living it." The sun dipped behind a cloud, the Highland wind gave a sharp, playful whistle through the eaves, and PC Hamish Macbeth, the smartest man in the county, took another slow, contented sip of his coffee.